I'm going to do a kind of brief intro here, and then we'll welcome our speakers to the stage. So my name is Nick Gates, and I'm a policy advisor for OFE, where I focus on public sector adoption and understanding of open source, support and investment in the open source ecosystem, but also what I refer to as the internationalization of open source, or open source for good, OSPOs for good, some might say. Many of the things that some weren't even talking about in this room until just a few years ago. So my background is in global development, where I've worked on digital government and open source. As an outsider, an American even, I understood Europe's paramount role in the open source ecosystem and on digital regulation, but I wasn't really privy to what was happening in the exchange between Europe and the rest of the world when it came to open source topics. So this open exchange of ideas, so to speak, will be the focus of our panel today. And I have a great lineup of panelists here to help me do that. I want to introduce our panelists on my own so that we can save too much of the self-introduction and get straight into the rest of the discussion. First up, we have Ms. Ariane Labat. Ms. Labat is currently head of unit for digital transformation at the Directorate-General for International Partnerships at the European Commission. Ms. Labat, please welcome to the stage. Next, we have Ms. Sunita Grote. Sunita leads the ventures team within UNICEF's Office of Innovation, leading investments in frontier technologies, including open source solutions from emerging markets. Welcome, Sunita. You can cross, yes, sorry. Moving on, we have Ms. Nele Leosk, who until very recently was the ambassador for digital affairs for Estonia. In her role as digital ambassador, Nele was responsible for the development, management, and implementation of Estonia's digital diplomacy. Welcome to the stage. And finally, we have Ms. Liv Martin Nordhaug. Liv spearheaded the creation and launch of the Digital Public Goods Alliance in 2019 and served as its co-lead from 2020 to 2023. She is now the CEO and leverages 15 years of experience with the Norwegian Agency for Development Cooperation, or NORAD. For those astute observers, we have a panelist who is not able to make it today, Mr. Paolo De Rosa, who is the CTO for the Digital Identity Framework at the European Commission. He's unwell and he sends his apologies. Okay, how is everyone doing? Let's jump in. As we sit here today, there's a lot changing in the world on both the geopolitical and digital fronts. It may be hard to separate the two even. We live in a world that is more multipolar than ever, with geopolitical uncertainty and competition shaping many different aspects of global digital cooperation, particularly given recent trends in both Europe and North America. This makes the imperative to provide technological choice a vital one, and one which I would argue that Europe has done more than any other continent to help advance. Let's talk about that choice and how it can be effectively leveraged and utilized to not just support what Europe does for Europe, but what Europe can do with and for the rest of the world. This has important political implications, not just for Europe's positioning of itself, but also for foreign assistance, development, cooperation, and foreign relations, very tangible things. Ms. Labat, I wanted to start with you. I am eager to explore this question of how Europe shows up in global digital cooperation, so all of these policy events that we're a part of. Europe has a robust history with open standards, advancing public investment in open source, as well as a thriving ecosystem of open source developers and businesses. But I would argue that not all of it is well known abroad, which can be especially hard with a, until previously, until just a few years ago, niche topic like open source. So from your vantage point on the inside, how can European policymakers align open source policies and principles with the global digital cooperation agenda? And are there specific areas of policy friction that you think might be worth addressing?
First question, thanks a lot for welcoming me to this great panel. From the European Commission side, the way we approach it, we really we see a convergence of interest from a number of countries in Africa, in Latin America, Caribbean, in Asia Pacific, who really share this interest that we have to drive a human-centric digital transformation and to address the digital divide. So that's really this convergence of interest. And then we get into what we call partnerships, digital partnerships, whether at regional level or at country level, depending on the scale and how we can best meet each other's interests with respective communities. And we do this in a Team Europe approach. This is very fundamental from our side. It's the European Commission colleagues for sure with our instruments, but also each and every one of our European member states who are bringing not only their national experiences from a regulatory point of view, but as well as their private sector and the interaction of these two groups of stakeholders. Then we form, digital partnership with countries with whom we share this interest and with whom we think we can really move forward together. And this partnership, the important thing is that they are integrated. We come in as risk taker. We cover the risk of very large-scale infrastructure investment, be it in subsea cable, be it in secure and trusted connectivity in countries, be it in satellite connectivity, and then we assemble the layers about that. We help governments develop their own regulatory framework, their innovation frameworks, through capacity strengthening, through training, through exchange of experience. And we also help put in place financing access for innovators. To give you just illustration of how it's happening on the ground, we have, for instance, with African counterparts, the program that we call Safe Digital Boost for Africa. This is 100 million grant investment from our side. And that's really that layer, that building block where we can help governments develop at regional level interoperable solutions for their sub-region to really boost commerce locally, to boost the recognition of digital identity across borders in Africa, for instance, just to name a few examples. And also, we are really proud that we support OSPOs. We do support Kenya and Trinidad and Tobago, for instance, to really boost that local capacity to develop government-oriented solution. And last instrument I want to highlight, because really it's a plea to you to join us, to join forces. We have what we call the D4D Hub. It's a platform where you can meet already 16 member states from our side, very, very actively engaged. It's representative of Ministry of Foreign Affairs, of Development, of ICT, of Economics, wherever our strengths are, our banks, our development banks, alongside the private sector. And together we are this kind of engine room when we think through how can we get back to Kenya. Okay, there is this OSPOC, what can we do else around that? So that Digital for Development Hub does have a private sector advisory group, and you're more than welcome to join force with us there.
And just a brief follow-up before we go to our next panelist. So regarding that question of specific policy areas that might be worth addressing, do you see any misalignment between what Europe is doing on open source and what the rest of the world is doing on open source, but also what the Commission and member states are doing through their foreign cooperation? Are there any areas that you might highlight that you think would be worth addressing as we go forward?
So apologies that Paolo is not there. But he is really the champion of the EU digital wallet. But so are we. There's a tremendous appetite, definitely, for the experience of the EU digital wallet from our partner country, and we really try to listen and also exchange experience. There's not. This is a two-way conversation.
Great. So I wanted to come to Nele next. There's a lot happening now on open source, but it often gets disguised in different policy language. People readily use the terms digital commons, digital public infrastructure, open source for good, digital public goods. But I still have a hard time in my head linking the EU's robust internal policy around open source with its tech diplomacy. So from your perspective as a former tech diplomat and an Estonian citizen, what is the real value in your mind that open source brings to conversations around the use of digital technology for good? And where can Europe strategically leverage open source, particularly around internal and member state efforts, as it positions itself in the world?
Yeah, thank you, and I'm happy to be here, actually for the first time. But when I first took my position as a digital ambassador almost 5 years ago, was also the first time I actually heard of the term that some of that you mentioned, like digital public infrastructure and digital public goods. And at first I didn't really understand what was behind it, but quite quickly I realized that everything that we are talking here is actually the base for digital public infrastructure or digital public goods. So in a way, we can say that in this global digital collaboration or digital development, digital public goods and digital public infrastructure merged as a new term or a new trend for actually that we have been doing not only in Estonia, but also Europe already for so many years. So these principles that we talked about yesterday and today around openness, sharing, co-creation, simply translated into the digital world. So when we look at Estonia, for example, our public sector developments need to be open source. We are firm believers of reuse. We reuse, let's say, our infrastructure. We share it across the country, but we reuse also different components that, let's say, build this digital society. And not only across sectors in Estonia, but also across borders. Many of you may know Estonia has developed the interoperability framework and the solutions that we are developing together with Finland and Iceland. And in this, from this perspective, I would say that Europe is really one of the main, I would say, let's say, regions or these different countries that really have built a really open and inclusive digital society. But the other thing that I also very quickly realized with this emergence of digital public goods and digital public infrastructure is that it puts, I would say, emphasis on some basics. Because for a long time, there was this Estonia digital model, Europe digital model, Singapore digital model, some other country digital model, but actually there is one model. We know what are these crucial elements that we need to build a safe and open digital society. We cannot leapfrog. So we need data, we need identity, we need databases and some other aspects. But maybe to come, let's say, to this downsides of this trend, I see a lot of enthusiasm in this room. Energy, that open source is better, it's superior, it's a community, it's openness and sharing. And unfortunately, I have to bring us down to say that the world that I was past 5 years is business as usual. Open source, DPGs, DPI, whatever we call it, is driven by very few powerful players. And not necessarily the big tech that we like to blame. These are other states, international organizations, renowned philanthropies. So from this perspective, considering that actually DPI or DPG or whatever other term we use stands for something that Europe has done for years, and considering that we know the complexities of this geopolitical landscape, I think and I know that Europe has been maybe criticized for not having a DPG agenda or DPI agenda. I believe Europe has done perhaps well not to jump on a new trend without, let's say, coherence and knowing that it is really driven by a few players. But Europe can play on its strengths to be this trusted partner for its global players, and perhaps more trusted because it is technologically a little bit weaker than our main competitors in this global landscape. But I do agree, and it has been also talked here before, that what Europe has not, I believe, done well is really to have, I would say, value-added, powerful offer to its global partners. And I think this is missing. There has been the reference to Eurostack. I would say it goes much beyond Eurostack. Messaging is a very powerful tool. So our current, or Europe's current messaging is largely limited to regulations, maybe a bit to human rights, and it's definitely not enough. So what Europe really needs to do is to situate itself amidst these trends and focus on its strengths, but have a coherent approach, not just a stack or one solution or the other solution, but I would say like this comprehensive offer that we need to build the society that we believe in.
Before we go to our next panelist, I very briefly wanted to come back to this idea of DPI. Maybe for some in the room, if you could just very briefly explain kind of the DPI concept, and maybe talk a little bit about how it's become politicized in the last few years and what it all might mean for Europe.
Yeah, DPI may mean different things to different, different people, but what it means to us is basically, I guess we can make a parallel with a regular infrastructure. So the origins are in these democratic principles that whatever a government does, you contribute it back to a society. So the same way we have built roads and bridges, we have a digital infrastructure, or an infrastructure that is needed in order to build, I would say, our digital society that we share. So I would still say that for us the origins is in building an open, inclusive state that simply has transferred into the digital space. But I would still say that when I look at the current maybe discussions around DPI, the concept is still quite limited. And I know Liv is here. Estonia is also part of the Digital Public Goods Alliance, and there are many things that we support. But it is rather limited to a few components of digitalization. And I would say that maybe this discourse is maybe, to our view, maybe too limited, and maybe also, I think, comes from the times Estonia started to build its society. I think it's a bit stuck maybe 20 years back when we talked about data and identity and interoperability. I think in nowadays world we have to really go beyond it and see, okay, how do we build our, let's say, compute capacity, how we distribute it to these partners and stakeholders that we have in our societies, it academia, private sector, and so forth.
Thank you. Liv, I wanted to turn to you next. So the European innovation ecosystem has a lot to offer in terms of open source alternatives, open source developer expertise. These ideas and solutions don't always get prominently situated in these very high-level international conversations. For example, there's been a lot of discussion recently around kind of office alternatives in products used by the Commission. This is in part what the recent policy attention on digital commons and digital public goods is all about, the idea of offering open source and open alternatives with robust communities and governance models to support them. Could you kind of compare and contrast your views on digital public goods and your understanding of what Europe is talking about when it comes to digital commons, particularly that idea which is being promoted by the next generation internet? In your mind, what are the most important lessons that can be drawn from European efforts to create and scale robust and open technologies and solutions?
Thank you. That is a really nerdy question. I'm going to try to answer it brief. But first, I would like to start by mentioning that I'm also Norwegian. So I'm a European, and I was also here yesterday. And I would like to start by saying that I'm actually really proud that Europe didn't win the race to develop the big techs we have today. I think that's not something we should kind of feel ashamed of, like we didn't do it. We should actually be proud, and it puts us in a really good place as Europe. And now I'll swap my hat to being the leader of the Secretariat for the Digital Public Goods Alliance. But I want to keep that with us, that let's start and look ahead with a position of strength and not necessarily feeling ashamed of not having managed to put us where we are today. That being said, I do think that now is really, really the time to ramp up and provide the public interest open source alternatives that can then provide an alternative. And I think there is a huge, huge opportunity for Europe to play a stronger role also in the global and international part of that process, including what pertains also to the international development side of things. And to be more specific on your question, digital public goods, it's something that can be operationalized through a standard. And it's a concept that comes from the UN Secretary-General's high-level panel on digital cooperation. It builds on also like common goods and Elinor Ostrom and public goods theory. But it delineates, in a way, the open source landscape to look at open source digital solutions that can be both software, content, AI systems, data, and open standards across. But we have gone beyond that to also look at how they have been built to minimize the risk of doing harm, that there is some relevance to attainment of the Sustainable Development Goals, which is admittedly a pretty broad tent. And also we look at documentation ownership. So it's open source plus in a way. But there is a DPG standard that is operationalized, and it's governed as an open standard, and it's maintained by the DPG Secretariat. And it is possible to look at whether or not a digital solution is a digital public good. And then with the digital commons term, which of course you in a way have much more context on than me, but the the understanding that I have of that is that it's more aspirational in its publicness. It's about open, but it's also about open source that is governed in the open and for and by the public. And the challenges, in a way, is that what good governance looks like. It's really hard to have like a strict standard for assessing that because it's really context dependent. But there is an aspiration there, and I think there's real value to that. With the DPG standard, we only look at like, is there clear ownership? And we also assess annually that the specific solution is maintained as a DPG. But we don't go beyond that in looking. And you can have a DPG that is being shared by a single entity. So, for instance, UNICEF, to take an example, UNICEF is also a value DPG member, or Estonia individually could share a DPG. That idea of more shared governance is not something that's required. That being said, many product owners that are involved in maintaining the DPGs are also very, very commons-oriented. And I see huge potential for the kind of sweet spot that is both, and I think it's particularly relevant when we look at, and I agree with Nele, what DPI means, but where we look at these more infrastructural technology components, and I would say both in areas and for components like verifiable digital identity, real-time payment, secure data exchange, but also going into communication and public discourse and social media technology. I think there would be really strong value to looking at having more technologies that are actually both kind of verified on some parameters to be open enough to have the licensing in place, the documentation in place, certain do no harm principles in place. So that would be the DPG standard, but that are doing more and are more aspirational and have, for instance, are sharing, at least sharing a technical roadmap where it's a clear understanding of how you can contribute and be part of evolving that technology and so on, and how you can be part of it. So that's something I would love to see more of. And can I say that there's a blog coming today, Nick?
Yes, at some point today.
We have written a blog. It's coming out today. Take a look.
So I want to kind of ask the audience to forgive me a little bit. We are talking in policy speak, and that's not always going to resonate with many of the people in this room, but of course this is a policy event, and how people understand and use these terms to advance conversations around financing and resourcing open source software and open source solutions is an important one. So Liv, just in brief follow-up, I'm wondering if you could make the pitch for why using these terms is important when communicating with policymakers, and what the advantages are in thinking about your projects or your collaboration in these terms.
I think it's super important to be specific. And I heard something earlier today about moving from talking also to doing. But in order to do, I do think we need to be able to verify and to actually operationalize some things. And I think having some minimum common operational understanding of what that is, I think that matters. Because there is a lot of open washing out there, and we're seeing it all over the place now in the discussion around what open AI means, or open source AI. And I do think we do need terms that mean something to move it forward. And I also think there is tremendous, and maybe there will be an opportunity to elaborate a bit more on this, but there is tremendous soft power also in living by certain principles and standards where you can actually verify that they're met. And you can kind of, you have that out in the open. So I do think, but we need to practice these principles also, and not only have them. So they only mean something when they are actually defined and used.
Sunita, I wanted to finish off this initial round of questions with you. So we've taken arguably a very Eurocentric point of view so far, but of course open source is global. Open source is not just European, as we talked about this morning. So you have a strong view of what's happening globally with your work with UNICEF. Maybe you could talk a little bit about what other regions' approaches to open source innovation look like, whether it's in the public sector or just in industry or in communities. And you could talk a little bit about, what your work with the UNICEF team has looked like and what you're learning from people that are doing work on the ground all over the globe.
Thanks, Nick. It's almost an impossibly big question, so I'll try and tackle a little bit. Maybe we can start by just zooming out and then going into the detail. I think we heard a bit from Omar this morning or just before about what's happening at the UN level. I think what we're seeing there is kind of consolidation of efforts that have been happening, maybe in a slightly more disjointed way by individual organizations in the UN system, to try and come up with something that can guide us as an entire system, and then by consequence, how each of us engage with our member state partners on the ground and kind of how resources are allocated. And I think that's just from the UN system perspective is a huge leap forward compared to where we were a couple of years ago. We also see that reflected in kind of recent international policies. So we have the Global Digital Compact that was launched last year, where we have some very clear language around the value of digital public goods in ensuring kind of inclusive and equitable digital transformation at the country level. For us, those are it's a continuation of commitments we've had for a while. So Leif made reference to the high-level panel. So this has been in place for probably about 7 or 8 years in terms of language that we use, but it's really great to see that that's being preserved and is being kind of, every time we see that commitment reiterated, it's kind of being stepped up a notch in terms of what it connects to. The other piece, which we've already heard about, is kind of the growing engagement with this term DPI. And so we're seeing a lot of donors and EU member states as well kind of showing their commitment to supporting digital public infrastructure. I think just to reiterate some of the concerns or some of the points that Nele and Leif both have raised is that we actually don't have a clear definition of what DPI means, but it's being increasingly referenced in either national policies or also in kind of global frameworks. And from our perspective, that's a little bit of a concern because we can then see also that at times we see a very limited definition of what that means. And Nele made reference to that a little bit, but it's necessary, but in no way sufficient to achieve kind of the ambitious goals, right, that we've set ourselves as a global community to achieve by 2030. And so that's kind of a piece where I think we have to listen to the realities of what countries need, and what sometimes is interpreted as DPI is by no means kind of this what's sufficient, where investment is needed, where donors and other kind of partner countries can provide support. The role of open source within that is also obviously critical. Again, DPI doesn't necessarily mean open source. The word public doesn't necessarily mean the same as in digital public goods. And so that's a major thing that kind of we want to keep pushing. We're seeing countries absolutely recognizing the importance of that. So there's, if we look at kind of policy frameworks, there's procurement frameworks that are putting open source first or open source by default. We're seeing investment in kind of in-house teams that are able to design and locally implement infrastructure pieces within DPI. So countries like Ethiopia, Cambodia, and others, Sierra Leone, that's really got that as part of their national policy infrastructure policy teams that are able to execute at that level. And I think that's something that when we look at where to place long-term investments and support, either as the UN system or as bilateral donors or as the EU, those are really important structures to support because that's what's going to build capacity in the long term. It's where we get sustainability. It's also where we get value capture for those countries in economic development that can be tied to these efforts. On the industry side, you kind of asked me to reflect a little bit on what we've been doing at UNICEF, maybe just to use one very specific example. Beyond our work with the DPGA and with Leif's team, we've been hosting for 10 years a venture fund that provides seed and growth funding exclusively to entrepreneurs that are developing open source solutions in developing and emerging markets. And so we've supported, I think something, I should know this number, but it's something like 80 plus ventures across those markets. And we've really, because of that portfolio and because of that track record, we've been able to take away some of the lessons and maybe help debunk some of the myths of what we hear around open source. One of them is around the fact that open source doesn't make money and digital public goods can't make money. I think our portfolio has shown quite the opposite. We provide seed funding across the portfolio. Those companies have been able to bring in 12 times that amount in co-funding or follow-on funding of all sorts of financing instruments, right, including equity and debt. We've seen a number of them actually exit. And so what we know about big software players in the open source space, we're seeing reflected in kind of those entrepreneurial efforts that are happening in those markets. And to us, that's kind of trying to be demonstrators, where we're trying to use the fund to demonstrate where investments could be flowing, how other donors and partners could support entrepreneurs in those markets. And most importantly, also having to build up those ecosystems. We know that less than 1% of VC capital flows to Africa. Just let that sink in for a second. less than 1%, goes to that entire continent. And so what can we do as other players to complement that, where private capital may not be playing the role that it could? How can we attract additional investment? How can we design kind of creative financing instruments, right, that leverage what we have at our disposal together with incentivizing the private sector to come in? And then finally, kind of a focus on diversity, right? And I think that's the piece that we want to kind of flag here. A lot of times open source communities and those that have the resources and the privilege to be able to contribute to things, it's very much tied to resources and networks. So one of the pieces that we are trying to invest in very heavily is being able to build up those communities in other markets and look at how contributions can be incentivized. How can we create a marketplace where that's actually there's a value placed on that to contribute to building up some of the DPI and some of the digital public goods that would be valuable to other governments.
Thank you so much. We're going to open it up to the panel for the next kind of bit, but I wanted to come back to this question of open source as infrastructure, and it's what is kind of consistent with the idea of DPI, though DPI really has a kind of capabilities or a service delivery focus, and as we mentioned, DPI is not necessarily open. In fact, I would argue that digital public infrastructure kind of emerged kind of as a cousin of digital public goods and this idea of being open source, but there's actually been a politicization of DPI, and we see DPI that isn't very open or that has the veneer of being open. So I recently wrote a piece about DPI and digital commons where I argued that the Commission has an unrealized strategic advantage in positioning open source, open standards, digital commons in these conversations around building foundational public sector technology stacks. The EU doesn't have an official policy on DPI or on public infrastructure, but I wanted to tug on that idea a little bit more and see, is my supposition a good one? Like, what are the most pressing needs in terms of European public infrastructure, and how can that be relevant for the work that the rest of the globe is doing? Liv. Slightly provocative question.
I think you're onto something, Nick. So I'll mention the Global Digital Compact as something that I think could be a really important vehicle. So for those, it may not be a term that everyone is familiar with, but basically this is a compact that was negotiated and adopted by all UN member states in September last year. And it has a paragraph on digital public goods and digital public infrastructure. The digital commons term did not make it into the compact. I know there were many who were asking for it, and I think the reason why it didn't make it into the compact is probably for the same reason that I mentioned earlier, that it's a bit fussy in the sense that it can mean different things to different people because it depends a bit on context, even though it has certain aspirations. However, I think that represents a tremendous opportunity, particularly for this infrastructure space, because I think Europe could show the way on how to develop open source alternatives for enabling digital public infrastructure capabilities. However, I think I feel like I'm a little bit uncomfortable when I hear too much about like European stack, European thing, this European, and I think we need to be really, really careful on how and when we use that, because I think it's not really tempting for someone else to reuse and adopt something that's called like, this is our thing. We are sharing it with you, but it's our thing. So I think there is something to look into. What is the essential European part? I think there's a tremendous opportunity for building in, first of all, European values, norms, and also regulatory compliance in how something is built. The commons aspect, to be really careful about governance. I think it will be interesting to find out what good enough governance means in that context. And I would actually like to point, I think the X-Road example that Nele alluded to, which X-Road is actually a digital public good. And the NIS model for governing X-Road, I think it's a very interesting one because X-Road is being used across the world. The global footprint is so much, much bigger than the European countries that are involved in it. But I do think that building in the Europeanness in what is actually done, rather than kind of being finger pointing and preaching about like Europe being much better and greater on all fronts. I mean, I am a European, so I'm not against Europeans, but I just think it's important demonstrate it in practice rather than talking about it. And I think that can be done through the open source technologies, through how they're built, through the transparency, through the technical roadmap, how is that shared, and through really providing reusable, adoptable, and adaptable alternatives that probably many other countries and stakeholders in other regions of the world can benefit from. But then please also provide an opportunity to share and contribute back, because you would be amazed, as Sunita alluded to see the innovation capabilities and what is actually being built by African countries like Sierra Leone, for instance, and many other countries out there that are making great stuff. So I do think there is real value also to being open in that way. But please don't do the nationalistic kind of, that part of European, that I feel uncomfortable about. And you won't win in that way. And the soft power comes by doing it, not saying it, I would say.
Anyone else want to respond?
Yes, I actually wanted to maybe continue what I started before on the Europe's role, and the keyword here, I think what we have also been discussing is sovereignty. It's not only Europe that is concerned for sovereignty, but it's increasingly growing also in the countries that Europe is collaborating with. And I think here Europe has a role as a trusted partner, not to tell, okay, this is the best solution, or that is the best solution, because we know that even though the second one might be open source, because this too has its own implications and can also actually not help to build sovereignty, but to help our partners to come to a level where they are able to see these choices that they have. Because currently what we are still doing, and not only Europe, I mean globally, we are still telling the others what is the best for them, as opposed to helping them to come to the level that they know what is the best for them. But I think Europe here also actually has quite a bit of a variety to offer. Europe is not just one country, Europe is 27 countries. And I'm really sorry that Paolo is not here with us today, because, for example, Wallet is a good example of how Europe can provide variety within the same framework. There are, hopefully, soon we will have at least 27 different wallets, all open source. So that is, in a way, a choice or a variety for our global partners to choose from, as opposed to, let's say, of a wallet of just one country or just one big company. So I would say that, let's say, us being varied is also, let's say, our strengths in becoming the trusted partner.
Did anyone else want to go? Okay. I wanted to, just kind of wrap things up by talking about, all of these policy discussions are happening all over the globe, and it's of course important for Europe to show up in those conversations, but it's also important to be, circumspect about what has a nationalist dimension and the importance of global collaboration. But I have a question of kind of like what it all adds up to. So we're doing a lot on open source here in Europe, but there's also a question of should those values be shared with the rest of the world? So what does success look like in terms of showing up in international conversations and talking about open source, even if we don't take a nationalist perspective necessarily?
Again, a broad question, but I want to build on what Liv just said before about what success looks like for us. Is really local solutions built with a local ecosystem where we are just, if you like, in the backdrop, providing whether be it financial instruments to make sure that the local venture capital community is growing, or providing financing solution for the government who want to do major sector reforms and embark onto new solution of not just digital ID. There's a lot of other solutions that our partner country government are interested in. To give you a very simple example, we have an e-freight system that is being rolled out that we really see is cutting the cost of how custom operates, and these are concrete examples that partner government are interested in, and where they want to know who are the promoters of this concrete solution in our national system and just learn from it. And then from that, use it as a new solution. So we are really not promoting, a European facade. We are putting forward the tools, be it financial or regulatory or experiential or contacts with private sector, so that national solution can emerge. And we're really seeing it picking up in Nigeria, in Kenya, and Rwanda. We partner with local champions. We have a very, very strong partnership with Smart Africa, for instance, that is gathering the front runners in the African continent, in the government, who really want to test some regulatory approach and some way to really leapfrog the system. So that's the way we do it, but ultimately the success is in that on the ground the solution will be ensuring cybersecurity, will be ensuring digital sovereignty for real, for the citizens and for the business there.
Did anyone else want to jump in?
Yes, I will, very shortly. Of course, we all know that there are economic incentives behind every cooperation, but I would say that it's increasingly also an issue of security, because we see our world is very divided. Liv mentioned Global Digital Compact. Those who do not know, last September, the world, all countries in the world agreed on how we are going to, let's say, some principles how we are going to govern technology. But what also became clear during this process, at least to me, that I was very actively involved in this while still in my previous position, is that we do not agree on very basic principles, actually. We don't agree on what is governance to us. Is it just the states deciding how we should live our lives, or is it us together deciding how to live our life in this digital space? Privacy, security, human rights, and Liv referred to digital commons. The digital commons did not go to the compact because of these very different understandings, how we see very basic principles in our life. So I think ultimately our cooperation with our partners, in addition to economic reasons, is because how we see the world and how divided we are. So we hope that there will be more people thinking like us than less.
So we do have to wrap up, but I wanted to just give each panelist a chance to say very brief final remarks, and in particular, maybe there's any specific ideas, projects, collaborations that give you hope. I'll start with you, Ariane.
So fundamentally, join us. I said it. Join us on the D4D Hub. We want to reduce the digital divide globally, and we need your ideas and strength to do that.
Sunita?
I think we need to come together to be able to counter some of the narratives that we hear and some of the forces that are at play. Some of that is around short-term immediate win versus like long-term investment and systems and sustainability. That's one of those trade-offs that I get faced with all the time within my own organization, is that question of like, is it possible to quickly achieve the same numbers, the same reach that we are under pressure to deliver on? And I think that's where kind of coming together under common narrative would be really powerful.
Nele?
Yes, in between different positions, I would call the Europe, but also everybody in this room, to help Europe to prepare this comprehensive digital offer, so that every European politician knows what the messages are, that every diplomat knows what the messages are, but also that European people know what these messages are to strengthen Europe's role globally. So here I don't see any sort of downside, Europe as Europe being stronger in the world.
Liv?
So I'll start by saying that I disagree slightly with Nele on open source and proprietary being like one or the other, that it doesn't really matter. I do think that having open source principles or open source first principles for governments and others is critically important also for building agency and capabilities. And if you don't have those adoption and creation capabilities internally, you will do really, really shitty proprietary procurements because you have no capabilities, so you do not know what to buy. So I do think that open source is more than just that specific tool you adopt. It's also about a culture internally. So it doesn't mean that everything needs to be open source, but you need to have those capabilities. And I do think there's a means and end thing here. And here to the potential for Europe, I do think it's very important still to have choice also in then which open source alternatives exist if you're trying to have an open source first policy. And I would really, really invite more digital public goods coming out of Europe. And I invite everyone here who's building something, is involved in maintaining something, to look at digitalpublicgoods.net and see if there's a potential for nominating that solution as a DPG, because that is a really, really good way of getting visibility. We have members from all over the world. Digital public goods are referenced in the Global Digital Compact, and it's a way of making sure that what you have built is more discoverable. So I would call for that, and I would also call for, this is from Cable Green Creative Commons, I'll just say it quickly: buy what you need, own what you buy, and share what you own. And I think that is such a good statement for how we should think about technology.
That's a great note to end us on. Thank you to Liv, thank you to Nele, Sunita, Ariane. Can you please give them a big round of applause?